This is a cross-disciplinary project, and the overall goal of it is to advance the science to empower communities that are affected by compounding climate hazards, coastal flooding, rising groundwater, and salinization. And this is actually part of a project that's it's through a collaboration across several universities in 3 states. So Rhode Island, South Carolina, and Delaware. And for our purposes, we're very focused on Warren, obviously, but part of like the value of having these collaborators in other states is it allows us to leverage one another's like expertise and resources and analysis. So we'll also be kind of learning from our colleagues in other states moving forward. And while there's like some very unique characteristics of each of the focus communities in each state, there are common climate risks that these locations are facing, and some common impacts, like impacts to transportation systems, areas with kind of diverse economies, lower income populations, higher income populations, tourism areas being beach communities. And we're kind of coming to you with the, acknowledging from the beginning that unfortunately we don't have billions of dollars for massive infrastructure improvements. However, we do bring in a lot of research expertise, and we're hoping that if we really ask the right questions about the types of adaptation solutions that could potentially be applied here, it can set the town and the community up to go after bigger funding in the future, and kind of help us to deal with this very thorny issue, so many different costs and benefits to weigh, kind of create a space where we can identify some of the common priorities given trade-offs we need to deal with. And so, yeah, our goal today is to get to know what kind of information you need to know to make and inspire change here, whether you work in the town staff, whether you are a community member that is trying to help your community to adapt to a changing environment. So these are kind of the big research areas that we're pursuing with the project. Chris is leading work on groundwater modeling. So this is looking at water that you may be dealing with in your basements, water as groundwater rises, there may be impacts to underground utilities, looking at those issues. Mehrshad is working on the flood vulnerability, and he'll tell us a little bit about how his work can kind of expand on past work that's been done in Warren in that space. And our lead principal investigator, Emi Uchida, is working on the economic impacts and decisions, and how we can use those economics questions to kind of to weigh costs and benefits and understand perceptions of different solutions. And then we're also doing some research on decision maker perceptions, like how are elected officials and town staff, actually across the whole state, how are folks deciding where to invest and not when it comes to a focus on climate issues. And so with that, I'm going to ask Chris to give a little bit of an overview. I think some of this information may be familiar to some of you, may be new to others, just talking about broadly the sea level rise issues and climate issues we're looking at.
Yeah, we want to just give a background about what climate issues we sort of see happening here. If we think about sea level rise as one of the first major climate issues that we're facing right now, looking backwards in time, we've got tide gauges that measured what sea level was on average over the last, say, 100, 150 years. In Providence from 1960 onwards, you got this black line, and you see that it's going slowly up over that time period. And so up until that 2025, right now we know how far it's come up. Into the future, we don't exactly know what's going to happen. So what's going to happen in the future depends upon the decisions that we make with our policies in the future, whether we continue to burn fossil fuel at the rate we are, whether we change different economic decisions. So because of all that, and because of the uncertainties in any estimate, folks have come up with these 5 different pathways of what we expect sea level to do in the future based upon our estimates. I'm going to focus on this one here that by 2100 expects about close to 5 feet of sea level rise. That's the intermediate high. The intermediate low is about 2 feet and change of sea level rise. And you can see that, over the entire country, I'm not even showing the world, that these colors show that this is variable across the world for a number of different reasons. The entire East Coast, it's a relatively high rate of sea level rise. That's because we're doing things like sucking water out of the ground that actually causes the ground to compact in addition to everything else. That tends to be an important thing that we don't think about. That's really a big deal down in the Gulf of Mexico, where all that oil that we're taking out of the ground supports some of those sediments, and you take that oil and that water out of the ground, that actually collapses. And then you see up in Alaska, it's going the other way. They've got the other issue that their ports are actually losing depth because the glaciers that were there 10,000 years ago melted, but that land is still coming back up. So it's really interesting to think about this from that perspective. But this is to show that there is uncertainty as to what will happen, but that all of the estimates are saying that it will go up somewhere in the, close to 2 feet up to 5 feet range by 2100. When we're thinking about what that actually means, this is what mean low or low water will look like in the future. So if this is sort of right now what it looks like in the present day, 2025, with that intermediate scenario, you can see these sort of light blue shaded areas around here that if you had 2.25 feet by 2100, this is what it will look like in 2100. Areas that are definitely nice and dry at low tide will no longer be nice and dry at low tide. And if we do that close to 5 foot scenario, these are big. And this is low tide, this is not high tide. This is sort of the change that we're seeing there. And this doesn't really take into account like the big flooding issues, which looking backwards, we can see that in the past, these are, from 2020 backwards from there, these are the observed and projected sort of big tidal flooding events that happened in Providence. And you can see like from 1920, 1940, they didn't really record any. From 1940 to 1960, they started to have these tidal flooding events, maybe 1 or 2 per year, a couple years with nothing. As we move forward in time, you see that frequency increases per year, and there just hasn't been a year since, about 1996 or so, where there was not one tidal flooding event in Providence that came up. And so I put on Providence because that's the nearest NOAA tide gauge we've got a really good record for, and this is where we sort of see that going. We see that increasing in the future. And again, these projections, they're not really that certain. They depend upon that overall sort of global sea level rise and some other things, but these are sort of the projections of how frequently you expect these tidal things to go. And you can see with that intermediate projection, it tops out at about 365. So almost every day you'll start to see a day with, tidal flooding events if we have that high rate of sea level rise. If we got a lower rate, they won't be as common, but they will still be, every other day or so by the end of the century. So it's not something that we're facing like right now, right? We're seeing a slow change over the future. We've got time to adapt to all these things, but we want to set that context. And then finally, this is just from the sea, but flooding also depends upon what's coming from the land, all the precipitation. So in the Northeast, we're at this area where we expect precipitation to increase, and not by a whole lot if you look at it over the course of the year, right? Maybe 5 or 10% versus the late 20th century. That's what our climate projections tell us. But what we really expect to see is that the rainfall events will be heavy. So we may actually see, fewer rainfall events, but they're going to be heavier and more intense. And I think you all know that when you get those heavy, intense events, that's when that flooding tends to happen. So that's what we're expecting to see. We expect winter and spring, when you have a lot of water anyway, we expect most of that water to be added during that time. And that during the summer and fall, when it's already pretty dry, we expect, if anything, the precipitation will be flat. And it can actually dry up because with that increased temperature, we get more evaporation. And so you may see increased drought even though the amount of water coming out of the sky is about flat. Finally, the last thing I think I want to talk about here is just this idea of, we use these terms like risk and hazard and vulnerability and exposure. And I think we wanted to define them a little bit. Hazard is like the event, it's what it does. Vulnerability is the susceptibility to damage. Exposure are what is exposed. And all those together come to risk. So I think about risk as like the multiplication of these 3 things. If you have something that is likely to cause a lot of damage if it occurs, but doesn't occur frequently, the risk could be relatively low, even though if it did happen, it could be catastrophic. Whereas if you have something that happens every day, but the hazard of that, like the cost of that would be low. It could be pretty high risk because it's happening so frequently, right? So it's sort of the sum or the product of that we sort of think about when we're thinking about risk. And with that, I'm going to pass off to Mehrshad for a moment.
Thanks. I'm also just gonna, this is just some scrap paper, and I'm gonna pass out scrap paper and pens so that if you have like questions you wanna write down while Mehrshad gives this brief presentation, so you don't forget them. I'm a big note taker, so just want people to have the chance, if that's helpful.
Thank you. So with that, kind of remember about the background, about the 3 different components of the climate change. So we can talk about a couple of slides about the flooding vulnerability. So usually talking about the surface flooding, we have 3 different categories that we define it as a flood. So the first one is when we talk about the coastal flooding, that technically this flooding due to the surge or if a winter storm or a hurricane make a landfall in Rhode Island. So I was wondering, can you raise your hand if you have heard or seen about storm tools, flood maps? Perfect. So I think over almost 10 years research and project at URI, kind of the coastal flood hazard map has been developed and is online available for the whole Rhode Island. And those, based on the definition of the risk, it gives you the hazard level for coastal flooding for different communities. And usually they are ranging based on different return interval, 25 to 100 and 500. And I just want to mention one example. If you look at the 25 years coastal flooding, usually there is a 4% of chance to have a flood every year. So 4% is a low number, but if you look at the 30 years that, for example, the time of the mortgage for the house, the probability of flooding is around 72%. So technically the homeowner for 25 years, there is a high chance that they experience flood during the 30 years of the home mortgage or the living. For the coastal flooding, the hazard map is available, but in this project we want to use those hazards in order to evaluate the risk, damage to the building and transportation system, and finally develop some mitigation strategy to quantify the loss. For example, what if we elevated the house foundation above the base flood elevation, how much the loss gonna decrease? For the urban flooding, we have more work to do, so we are trying to develop urban flooding which technically caused based on the rainfall, and where the storm system is kind of the backflow and you have the rain on the street and flooding. So we are trying to get more information about drainage network backflow, location of the pipes, pipe diameter, and it seems also there is no complete map for Warren for drainage system. So that's one question, that a discussion that we need to ask the community to provide those information for us, or the town, if we can go and kind of capture those details. Also at the end, we have the riverine flooding that we are not covering in this presentation, but there was another project at URI that looking at the riverine flood or inland flooding for Warren. So I just summarize 3 objectives. So the first objective in this surface flooding, we want to leverage the existing maps from storm tools to evaluate the risk to infrastructure, building, and transportation system. The thing, we want to evaluate the performance of stormwater management system, drainage, map everything, and evaluate the system based on different rainfall scenarios, and develop the hazard map. And finally, propose mitigation strategy. And one important thing we want to look at the compound flooding. What if when you have rain and a storm coastal flooding at the same time, what the community gonna expose and what's the loss value? And finally, the expected outcome would be the compound flood hazard map, risk map, and also mitigation strategy that can be tailored based on the user input. So just one example about the Warren, FEMA, different flood zone, VEAE. So you can see the 2 different scenarios, 25 years coastal storm and 100 with sea level rise. And you can see the elevation of the water that's going to be above the ground for downtown area in Warren. and especially for 100 years that so it's significantly vulnerable. So we want to include the building and transportation system into the account for vulnerability assessment. And just one point about the building inventory, we want to look at the details parcel by parcel data. So it's important if we know the building, for example, has a basement or not, or what's measure those values. And I think it's my last slide. So we are trying to get information about the drainage system for Warren. So this is a picture from the GIS Warren website for those data, but you can see the data is very incomplete, and we are looking for example, location of the inlet outlets, different pipe connectivity, pipe diameter. Those information help us to validate our model for the stormwater and urban flooding. I think that would be kind of if I have one question from you guys, how we can get that information to validate our model for the urban flooding piece. And I think in the discussion at the end, when we were talking about mitigation strategy for building, I just want to mention that usually they have different category, component level, building level, and community level. So we can quantify the effect of these actions into the model, and we see, okay, what if, for example, if you elevate the first floor elevation, how much gonna be decrease in your predicted loss in future? And these depends on the community, the priority, the experience, and those can be quantified in our model for different categories. So we are willing to hear from the community about all these input. I think that was the last.
Mehrshad, is it okay? Let's pause for just 1 second to see
Yes.
if folks have any clarifying questions.
Yeah.
What's the source of the GIS Warren data?
I think that online website, the GIS for Warren.
Right.
Yes, I think it's Rhode Island GIS.
Did it come from our GIS?
No, that information is through knowledge base of workers and through town, so it's not exact.
Yes, and it's missing so much information.
Yeah.
So
There was never an actual mapping done for the stormwater in the town area.
yes.
So I apologize, I was writing the question about wastewater while you were talking. And
Yeah.
so are you proposing to reroute the wastewater, say into a reservoir or aquifer, or what is your purpose in this?
So first we need to have a map of the existing stormwater system.
And I get that.
Once we have that, we can model the performance, evaluate it based on different scenarios, precipitation. And then based on that, we can say, oh, this part of the system, they have an issue, there's a hot spot, and they can be looking at mitigation strategy. Yes, for example, if there is a leaky pipe, we can propose to change those pipe, improve the system, or have kind of the retention pond to kind of navigate the urban flooding during the events. We can look at those.
I don't think that was my question. My question is, are you looking to reroute it from putting it in the harbor or ocean into an aquifer or reservoir so it can be used as opposed to raising the sea level?
Or collectible?
To the location of the buildings.
The characteristics of it.
Oh yes, there are tax data that we have for the Warren, and also there are one of the public building inventory called National Structural Inventory, and also another source is the AI machine learning that yes, we can have, for example, then knowing about the occupancy, number of the floors, stories, if the building has basement or not. So these are usually the public information that we have.
Okay, so it's available, but it's yet to be coded.
Yes, and it can be collected because they come different resources. So also we need to look at the uncertainty, but those details exist. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Quick question.
Yes.
You measured the tide, or is there a way of measuring the bottom to see what's growing on the bottom to possibly grow, make the tide higher? What is the sediment at the bottom of the river, or is there a name for it?
Yeah, the sediment.
Sediment, okay, so the sediment. Is there a way of measuring the sediment on the bottom?
Yeah.
And is that taken into consideration?
So I mean, there are things that we can measure about the sediment. I don't know of any stuff up here, but like where the bridge went across, we've got a map. Another thing I'm working on right now, where we've got a map of all the well holes that have gone into the bay, and you see that like, people have done a bunch of mapping, especially where like bridges have gone in, things like that. There've been a bunch of geotechnical things out there to see what's there. Sea level is not really dependent too much upon what the bottom of the bay looks like, right? It's like a global thing. Changing a little bit here or there is not going to change the overall sea level, at least in this area. One thing that it could do is just changing the shape of the ground could make some of the flooding better or worse. If you figure like sitting in a bathtub, there's the thing called a satiation effect, where if you're sitting in the bathtub and you sort of slosh a little bit, you get in and you raise the water level, but the thing that really makes it overflow is like if you move your whole body, it like sloshes out. And so the shape of the bathtub or the shape of like, these different bodies of water can matter for that. That is not something I think that we're really going to be looking at here, and that's not the kind of thing that I think many people are really looking at to really change a whole lot. Although that is, especially in really urban areas, they are doing some sorts of things with seawalls to try and block some of those kinds of things. Does that answer that question?
Well, it does, but even if you did have an answer, there's no way of measuring back 10 or 20 years in order to come to a conclusion, so.
Yeah.
Although we have talked in our group before about sort of congested or clogged, water arteries, like little creeks or riverbeds and things like that. So I don't know if that will be something maybe that is information that occurs or is looked at.
And if you're talking about streams, there are definitely things that, little streams and drainage canals, things like that. Opening those up tend to let water off the land surface quicker, which can be a good or a bad thing, right? If it gets off and goes all the way off, it can be great, but if it gets off and ends up on a major artery, and that's sort of where the low point is at that point in time, that can be a bad thing.
Just to add on to that, my previous home, I lived on a code over a 30-year period, the base of it raised 6 feet.
Mm-hmm.
So it does make a difference, and that was from wastewater coming from the streets.
For sake of time, I might move on to my next point. So I'm a groundwater researcher mostly. I think mostly about groundwater. And the interesting part in this whole project for me is that we don't know a whole lot about, as a scientific field, we have not paid a whole lot of attention to how groundwater impacts flooding in urban areas. And that's part of one of the overall piece of this project, is trying to understand that piece. So we just published this paper, and it was sort of a conceptual paper trying to just pose what some of the issues were for our scientific field. And so I thought it was a nice little picture to sort of talk about some of these things. So the first thing is I study groundwater, and most of my students that come in have no clue what that actually is, right? All that groundwater is water in the ground. And in an area like this, what that means is picture a sandbox, it's empty, and you pour water into it, and it fills the pore spaces, right? So groundwater is just any of the water that's down there, and anywhere below where it's saturated, right? If you look at the side of that fish tank full of gravel or whatever, and you pour water in so it's halfway up, anywhere below sort of where it's fully saturated, that's below the water table. That surface that is full, the top of the full saturation, we call that the water table. And so if you want to suck water out of the ground, you put your well in deeper than the water table, and you suck it out just like you are putting a straw in the ground. Above that's called the unsaturated zone. And so in other areas of the state, septic systems go into that unsaturated area. Things like your basements go into that unsaturated area. So we care about where that water table is, because if it comes up, your basement's flooding, or your septic system is no longer working, or your buried cables or your sewers are now interacting with the water table, probably in a way you don't like, especially if that's salt water, and you've got things that can rust or corrode. So we care about that water table also because that tells us where water's flowing. Water wants to flow downhill, so if we know the water table has an elevation of 10 feet here and the ocean has an elevation of 0 feet over there, that water is going to flow downhill towards the ocean. And if it comes up over here, it's going to flow quicker, and if it goes down over here, it's going to go slower. And if we have a big flooding event and the sea comes up, that means that water wants to flow into our aquifer, so we get salt water that will flow back the other way, and that can cause all sorts of different issues as well. So the other part of this, the last part, is that salt water is heavier. It's about an extra 40th of mass of fresh water. And because of that, it actually wants to like come underneath the fresh groundwater. And so even like in a natural setting, you expect that if you're at the coast and you drill down, at some point you'll drill into salt water. So you've got a limited amount of fresh water sitting on top of that salt water that you can actually pull from. If you suck that too hard, you're going to pull the fresh water up to take that place. And if you do other things, there's always just going to be salt water there. So one of the things I think about a lot is where is that salt water and what's going to happen as we do different things to cause that salt water to move. And so, this is one of the issues that we have is we've got flooding. I think this is a picture from Warren. You are probably much more familiar with this than I am. But here's a picture, I think driving right down Main Street or Market Street down there. And this is floodwater coming up and over. Some of that may be saline, some of it's maybe not salty. But if that comes up and over, then you've got salt water sitting on top of your aquifer. Especially if there's any unsaturated zone, that salt water will go right in there. And once it's in, it takes some time to flush back out. So now you've got salt water on top of all your stuff, your concrete, your pipes, whatever else, causing some sorts of damage. We can also just get water rising from below, flooding our structures. That unsaturated zone, the water table comes up, floods whatever is there, things like your basements. There was a study in Wilmington that I was involved in when I was down in grad school. And I was talking to someone who had lost their washer and dryer in their basement 3 times since they've been living in that house. And so we call it nuisance flooding. It's one of those things that we think about as just like it happens, but it's not really a nuisance when it's your washer and dryer that they're touching. It's the way I really try and remember that this stuff really matters to folks. It would matter to me. And then finally, this stuff is also coming in from below. So if we are playing with that salt water and it's a freshwater zone that we put our foundations in, and now that salt water comes up because something that we changed, it can start to corrode concrete. And that is exactly what happened down in Florida with that building collapse down there. It's that salt water got into the concrete foundation. It turns out that's what weakened everything. So what we do is we take all this, and sorry for the messy image, I threw it all together. We take all this and we plug it into models and we try and understand things. We can try and represent the system as it is, and then we can try and ask questions. If we turn this knob, what happens? If I raise sea level, what happens? If I change the amount of precipitation, what happens? And so what we're doing here is we're building a groundwater model that is coupled with a surface water model. We're trying to understand the water that's coming in, landing on the surface, how much of that runs off, and how much of that goes into the ground. And then we're trying to understand the groundwater and seeing how much of that discharges to the surface and goes back to that surface water model, and how much of that flows directly to the coast. We need to understand the groundwater so we can understand what's happening with that surface water and understand how that affects the surface flooding. And I'm just, as an academic, I'm interested in these weird things, but I'm really interested in what happens with the groundwater in these urban settings where you've got things like big paved parking lots that are controlling that interaction between the surface water and the groundwater. That's sort of the part that's really hard for us to get at, is once we start building on this landscape and it's no longer just a giant sandbox, what's actually happening. The sandbox we get really well. That's really established science, but it's where we've got all this urban infrastructure that's harder. So the objectives that I have are really, I just want to understand this stuff, number one. Just understand the science, especially that role of land cover, the paved stuff, the houses, the asphalt shingles, everything else. And then we want to understand how groundwater levels influence surface flooding risk. So what happens if we've had a lot of moisture recently, what's the flooding risk after that? Or if it's been a dry summer and we get that same storm event, what happens after that? And then finally, I want to understand that groundwater salinity piece. So what kinds of issues is that salt water going to do in the ground? And what kinds of questions should we be asking? So if you want to help me, the question that I have for you all is the thing that we don't know as groundwater people is like what's actually going on down there, unless we put some holes in the ground. So I would like to install some wells. A well, sorry, I think I did something here. There.
Re-expand right there.
Okay.
Great.
We don't know what's going on the ground unless we put a well in the ground. And so what a well looks like is this little piece of PVC right there. It's just a 2-inch PVC pipe or a 1-inch PVC pipe we stick down into the ground. We drill a little hole. You can see we'll probably leave a little bit of dirt and throw some grass seed when we're done. And if we're really good, we can mount it flush with the ground so you don't even trip over it when you're mowing your lawn. But that's the kind of thing that we need to put in the ground so we can actually make some measurements to make sure that our models actually are depicting reality. So that's the piece that we're looking at right now.
Yeah, so he's hoping some of us will sign up to have one in our yards,
Yeah.
in geographically spread out areas.
Yeah, and especially down in that Market Street area, trying to get some measurements there.
Was that hand raised for a question or
No,
to
I was just
volunteer
saying,
for
I
a
have a
well?
well
Oh,
great.
that's not in use that you
Okay,
can.
we'd love to chat with you afterwards.
Oh, great.
Are we
We have to
taking
move
questions
our
or are we
bodies
moving
a
on?
little, like-
Yeah. Right. Okay. So I thought it'd be nice if we turn the lights on for a sec. We do have time for a couple questions for Chris if anyone has them.
Actually really shallow, so that 10 feet is what we're aiming for. We want to be down below the water table, but we don't want to be really deep. And the area that we can drill into here is not that deep. It's sort of shallow bedrock and glacial stuff that got dumped by the glaciers over top of it. You can keep the well if you want it.
Sorry, Chris. I think if you don't mind running through these adaptation
Oh, sorry
strategies
about
really
that.
quick
Yes, I can do
as
that.
well. Okay.
I'm looking for another thing.
Yeah, I gotta look for one more thing. Okay, just to recap what we're doing next is like now that we have a sense of what these research questions are, we also have an idea of like some potential solutions that we could explore as we collect this data. And so Chris is gonna talk about a few of those and then we'll have time to get feedback from everyone and we'll have an activity where we get your feedback.
So, I mean, I think the point of what Mehrshad and I are doing in particular is we are building these models that try and represent reality as it is right now. And the benefit of those models is that we can then turn those knobs and say, what happens if sea level goes up by 2 feet or 5 feet? What happens if this goes on? Or what happens if we change something about the surface? Say we do put in some sort of mitigation process. What does that do in the future? Is it worth doing it? Is it not worth doing it? And a lot of those are value statements, so we're just going to give the data about what happened. We are scientists who are natural scientists. We are not equipped to even tell you how much it might even cost. We just want to give the information about what would happen. So the kinds of things that might be adaptations that would be applied in these kinds of settings would be things like disconnecting your downspout so that it moves water away from houses. Putting in rain barrels. One of the big things that we are trying to think about is, or as we think about flooding, especially from the land side, is one of the things you want to make sure happens is that all that water doesn't come right off of everything and flow downhill immediately. Anything that you can do to slow that water down and make sure that it doesn't get all the way downhill super quickly is going to reduce the flooding downstream. So we think about elongating the hydrograph, right? If everything rains and all that rain flows down the river in the first minute, that's a lot of water going down that river. But if we can spread that out so it goes over, say, a day or 2 days or 3 days, then the amount of water coming down there, you're not really going to notice that it's really there. So in that area of Market Street, if you can slow everything down from getting down there really quickly, you'd have less of a flooding risk down there as frequently at least. So things like rain gardens that capture the water, that are designed to really be sort of a pool that holds that water for a little bit and doesn't let it go off as quickly. Things like green roofs that use that water instead of being asphalt shingles that shed it immediately. Permeable pavement, bioswales, just things that catch the water and hold it there for longer will change sort of that flooding situation to something like that where your waters are much lower. We can think about engineering upgrades instead of those green solutions. So these are sort of like the more hard type things we can do, but things like sewer upgrades. I know there's some talk about having a tidal backflow preventer that keeps some of the water from flowing upstream through the drainage network during high tide events. In some places, larger pipes might be a thing that you would want to do. Or if you've got pipes that look like that, like I know I have in my house at home, because there are roots in there every time I rotor-root it, fixing those might also help with stuff. Changing sump pump practices or making sure that people adhere to the regulations that are already there can be helpful. Making sure that the sump pumps are not just dumping directly into sewers. I know I lived in a house in West Virginia where my sump pump was going directly into our sewer. I know it wasn't regulation, but it was there when I moved in and it was still there when I moved out. That kind of thing can be really bad, right? So we want to make sure that people are following what is supposed to happen. Physical barriers, things like seawalls, can prevent some of that coastal flooding. And then elevating buildings so that you don't even care if it floods, right? There are areas along the coast where people are just required to build up higher, so when you do have these flooding events, it comes in, it goes out, and nothing happens. So these are, trying to get freshwater drain either more quickly or slower, right? If we can route the water away from where we want it and get it off the land quicker, great. But if we can't get it away from where we want it completely. We want to make sure that it goes from those sensitive areas, goes through them much more slowly, so it's not all that water arriving there at once. We can reduce the groundwater table with some of these things so that groundwater is lower and it can absorb more of that water. We can prevent storm surge with things like seawalls. We can prevent salt water from flowing inland with things like the seawalls, preventing that overland runoff and percolation, or by changing the sewer systems to not allow that to happen as much.
Let's do a quick overview of this one.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, people can ask you individual questions.
Cool.
Oh, okay.
Is that, you want me to do more quickly now? I can't.
Okay, let's pull back up and just do like a
Sorry,
two-sentence summary.
pay
Two-sentence
attention to
summary.
time. Okay, so natural buffers and tidal marsh restoration, again, just putting things at the edge of the coast to try and keep water from coming inland, just making it a little bit softer so that can absorb the energy, keep the water from coming up, or make sure that whatever is there is not something that we're worried about getting damaged by it. So again, like these are the modeling questions that we want to ask. We want to see what does it look like if we apply any of these different kinds of things, and we want to know which ones of these the communities actually has any interest in investigating, right? We want to make sure that the answers we're giving you are to the questions that you want to be asking.
Thanks, Chris.
Yep.
Okay.
Been actually hand wavy in most studies, and so we want to have an accurate measure of what kind of impacts the community is feeling and experiencing, and how we can change people's and communities' behavior to deal with the vulnerability. So we have set 3 goals for the economics piece. First, I'm actually going to start with the goal 2, which is economic impacts. So we want to quantify how flooding as well as groundwater salinization is already impacting housing prices, and that's an important issue, and that's an important way in which the economic impact can be felt. We also want to understand these impacts with special attention to low-income and minority communities, and it might not be felt through the housing market, but in other ways, and so we want to do a careful study of the economic impact. Then we want to move on to solutions. Again, we talked about these physical engineering kind of solutions so far, but there are a bunch of other kinds of solutions, and we want to understand public preferences and how much the public is actually willing to pay in order to invest in these kinds of strategies. And finally, we also talked about different kinds of voluntary actions that each individual households can take. There are also collective decisions that the community can make. But how can we incentivize homeowners and the communities to adapt to climate change? So we're going to be doing different kinds of experiments to understand how people respond to incentives. Just to dive a bit deeper into each of these goals. So the first goal is to understand the public preferences for adaptation strategies. So specific research questions are, what do people prefer? Soft versus hard versus hybrid, public versus private initiatives, and the impact these strategies have. So it's not just about coastal adaptation, but it's also about biodiversity, it's also about alleviating water salinization, and also preserving the beaches. So what strategies do people prefer? How do spatial factors such as location and size impact those preferences? And then what kind of financing mechanism might lead to more support from the public? We'll be doing a public survey that will be open to everybody in Warren, in the town of Warren, and probably to a broader regional audience. This is just an example of what the survey might look like, but we'll be doing a public survey and using statistical analysis to analyze that data. So as an outcome, we'll be able to measure how much people are willing to pay for these different adaptation strategies, and understand equity trade-offs, as well as compare the values of different kinds of adaptation strategies. The next goal is to quantify the economic impacts. And one way we're going to be doing this is through impact on housing prices. So are flood risks and groundwater impairment leading to lower home prices in coastal communities? How about the combined effects of both storm and flooding damages and sea level rise? How is that compounding effect impacting housing prices? To what extent do the economics differ for low-income and minority communities? And to what extent do adaptation measures mitigate those post-storm price declines potentially. So we'll be doing a bunch of statistical analysis, possibly combined with some survey efforts to understand these economic impacts. And these economic impact measurements are so important in these policy debates because without quantified monetary values, it's difficult to say how much we'll be saving, how much will the community be saving by investing in different kinds of adaptation strategies. And finally, we'll be looking at different kinds of incentives that we can offer to either at the individual level or at the collective level, at the community level. And so it's not just about buyouts, but we'd like to look at a variety of voluntary and regulatory approaches to further the conversation about adaptation and see how different adaptation strategies mean for different populations. And we'll be doing what's called economic experiments, both in a laboratory settings that might involve the stakeholders in Warren, and also in field settings. And so laboratories, everything is hypothetical, but in the field setting, it's for real. So we'd like to do a small scale kind of a field experiment where we actually try out some of these incentive schemes. And so we'll learn about what might work, what might not work, and if it doesn't work, why it doesn't work. So this research is intended to answer those questions. Okay, so I will hand it back to
work with. And so so what we'll plan to do is really like digest all these great ideas and feedback we received from you. And then work with Kristen to come back and meet again with this group in the coming months. And I know that we've covered a lot today, so we can have like a more focused discussion, I think, next time around on one of these core areas and really continue the conversation over time. Because this project runs until the summer of 2028. So we've got, we're going to be rolling out the research and products along the way, but we've got time to work on this together, and we'll certainly come back to this group. In terms of kind of immediate next steps this fall, I was just talking with Brian about finding a time to sit down with some of the town departments and get more input from them on the process, and also talk about some of the data needs to make all of this happen. Emi mentioned that we'll be organizing some focus group discussions to move forward with some of the economic analysis. I think we've had some conversations with the heads and internally over really the last few days about a need to maybe have some focused outreach to renters in the Market Street area, and so we'll have some follow-up actions to figure out kind of the best way to get input, because obviously some of the conversation around how will flooding affect my home value, it's really different if you're a renter than someone who owns a property. So we want to make sure that's represented and that we can that we're supporting the key concerns that renters have too.
Yeah, and we have a very high percentage of renters in our town, so it's important to include them in this analysis.
Yeah. And I ended up glossing over this given some time constraints tonight, but we are going to be doing some surveying of decision makers in Rhode Island about kind of how are they deciding what kinds of climate issues they're most worried about, how are they prioritizing them in funding discussions. So I think we can circle back to this at a future meeting with the goal that, if we can kind of better understand what are the other kinds of avenues other communities are taking, what tools are they using to deal with their flooding issues, how are communities pushing for action on these issues, that we can have some insights that we can share back with this group as everyone is trying to figure out how to influence the conversation in Warren. And we were so grateful to have this chance to convene this kind of smaller group, but we will definitely be having some broader public meetings as well to bring in additional folks into the conversation. So we'll